The road to decisive victory for Ukraine opens more and more every day. Russia's dealing with internal revolts ensures the successful progress of Kiev's grand offensive plans. Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky's major current goal is to seize the advantage on the southern front lines. For this reason, while the trench wars in Zaporizhia continued, Ukrainian river troops took action in the Dnipro River to provide support to this region. Ukraine's Dnipro boat landing group, to which the U.S. has invested approximately $500 million, started an operation at midnight in Dnipro to turn the clashes in Zaporizhia in favor of Kiev and to control the situation on the southern front lines, including Kherson. A dozen boats from the dauntless Sea Ark patrol group participated in the operation. 62 coastal and river patrol boats are actively working on this boat group of Ukraine. In this particular operation, the lightly armored U.S.-donated Dauntless Sea Ark patrol boat relied on its speed to evade attacks. This boat's impressive maneuverability was an important asset to Ukraine's recently formed river fleet. In addition, this boat was a distraction for any Russian boat or naval force they might encounter in the Dnipro. The main goal of Ukraine's Dnipro boat landing forces was to reach the Crimean Peninsula via Kherson and liberate the peninsula from Russian control. For this purpose, the boats of the Ukrainian forces advanced at a maximum speed in the direction of Kherson, on the Dnipro River. After a certain time, the Ukrainian landing boats were navigating their course on the Kherson side of the Dnipro River and encountered the boat group of the Russian naval forces. Ukrainian landing boats were moving in a direction close to the coastal part of this water area, while Russian boats were mostly in the middle of the river. In other words, Russian boats were almost open to targets in the direction of the Dnipro Kherson. Since the speed of the Russian boats was slow compared to the Ukrainian landing boats, it was inevitable that both sides would encounter each other. But the mind-blowing tactic of the Ukrainian Dnipro naval forces required a little more patience, because the Ukrainian boats allowed the Russian boats sailing off to Dnipro to advance a little further on their course. The reason for this emerged after a certain period of time with the advance of the Russian boats on the Dnipro-Kherson Isthmus. It was ensured that the Ukrainian artillery on the coast took these Russian boats into range. So the Ukrainians used this tactic to target Russian boats, both from the areas near the coastline and from the coast. The Russian boats advancing towards the Ukrainian artillery were unaware of the sad end. As soon as the Russian boats entered the attack area, heavy shooting of the Ukrainian artillery began. Simultaneously, the Ukrainian landing forces following the Russian boats from the coastline accompanied the artillery attacks. The Russian boats were badly damaged and had to retreat, but Ukrainian forces had created an effective network of attacks in this critical area. While most of the Russian boats could not get out of the clash arena set up by the Ukrainians sent reinforcements to this region. The Russians suffered heavy losses in this critical operation by the Ukrainian landing forces. The most important result of the operation was that the Ukrainians had a great advantage in the Dnipro River to dominate Zaporizhia and Kherson. Moreover, another favorable condition was provided for the Ukrainian forces to create an attack corridor to Crimea. Even Russian sources admitted that this operation, organized by Ukraine's Dnipro landing forces with about a dozen landing craft, was successful. Telegram Channel 2 majors noted that Ukrainian Dnipro landing troops had effectively held a foothold on the river for the past 3 days. In addition, Alexander Kotz, one of the most famous military propagandists of the Russian Federation, stated that the Ukrainians had crossed the Dnipro River and increased their offensive operations in the Antonovsky Bridge area abnormally. The Russian military propagandists had to admit that the Ukrainian troops were not only stationed on the left bank, but continued to expand their bases. Against this background, the Russians were quickly evacuated as they feared that the Ukrainian armed forces would separate them from their main supply force. It has been reported that the total manpower of the Ukrainian army in the bridge area is close to 500 at the moment. A large part of this number consisted of Ukrainian infantry units, special forces, and underwater commando teams, while the other part consisted of Ukrainian patrol teams on duty in landing boats. In other words, the Ukrainians wanted to continue their successful advance in the Dnipro-Kherson direction. For this reason, especially, the patrol boat teams of the Ukrainian army were looking for the Russian troops left behind by boats and boats in this region. It was also very difficult for the Russians to withdraw and escape the Ukrainian attacks because the Novokakhovka Dam had collapsed and the water level had risen over most of the southern front lines, including at Kherson. Despite the receding waters, the retreating Russian forces cannot have gone too far, as maneuverability in these areas is still difficult. At present, it's predicted that soldiers in Russian boats who managed to escape from the Dnipro River will advance towards Kherson as small Russian assault groups are still in Kherson. This is an advantage for the fleeing Russian soldiers, as the clash is already taking place in the direction of the Dnipro-Kherson. Because if the boats between both sides had met in an area a little closer to the Zaporizhia region, the Russians would not have any safe harbor to escape to. As you know, the Ukrainians recaptured 8 settlements from the Russians in Zaporizhia, and effective and fierce clashes are still going on in this region. Therefore, if the Russian boats had been caught by the Ukrainian landing forces in this region, the situation would have been much different, and the Russians would have suffered a record number of military losses since the clash in Dnipro took place in the direction of Kherson. The Russians lost mostly to the landing craft. Of course, it's also claimed that many Russian soldiers were killed during these clashes. So how did the Ukrainians manage to hold the Russian boats in such a grip? And the Ukrainian artillery units managed to get the Russian boats in range. First of all, let's talk about how the Ukrainian artillery units got into their range and destroyed the Russian boats in the Dnipro. It was reported that Ukrainian medical units used artillery materials supplied from Poland in this region. Therefore, victory was inevitable as the Russian boats were not far away, and the Ukrainian artillery also used effective military materials procured from Poland. The fact that Ukraine's Dnipro boat forces had been following Russian boats for a long time was among the factors contributing to the successful conclusion of this operation. As a result, the Ukrainians had considerable success, and the tide on the southern front turned somewhat in favor of Kiev. After this striking operation, the Ukrainians continued to advance and conduct offensive operations on the southern trenches. Ukrainian forces began to intensify offensive operations targeting the Russian-occupied cities of Melitopol and Berdyansk in the Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff spokesperson Andriy Kovalev announced that the Ukrainian army advanced in the directions of Novofedorivka Pryteny, Makarovka, Horivnya Bil, and Novodanilovka-Robertina, after the offensive operation in Dnipro. In addition, Kovalev noted that the Ukrainian army concentrated the Russian forces on the defensive and hindered the advance of the Russian armed forces using the reserves and trying to retake the lost places. Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov was among the officials who made critical assessments about this striking advance of his army. Oleksiy Reznikov reported that the advance of the Ukrainian army on the southern front lines will be a little slower, but more determined than the operations in the liberation of Kharkiv. Russia, on the other hand, is aware that the main goal of the Ukrainian army is to reach Crimea. For this reason, we're witnessing the Russians building defensive fortifications on the southern front lines of Ukraine. By the order of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, especially the Crimean Peninsula is being tried to be turned into a fortress surrounded by walls. But there's one detail that the Russians forgot. Although Crimea has been turned into a strong defensive fortress, Ukrainians can launch an attack operation on the peninsula at any time with their drones. In summary, we can say that the Russians are trying to delay the expected bitter end. But the Ukrainians, of course, still need military and financial support in order to continue their offensive operation. For this reason, the policies of the USA and the West on this issue are of vital importance for Kiev. It's thought that these military supports will be accelerated in the coming days because the war is now starting anew violently. The Kiev government has set the rescue of Crimea as its ultimate goal. For this reason, the Ukrainian army may attempt to open a third front directly from Zaporizhia to the southern coast. In fact, this is not a new front, but it was a point that progress has not been recorded for a long time. But currently Zaporizhia is one of the front lines where Ukrainians carry out intense attacks. If the Ukrainian forces make advances from Zaporizhia to Melitopol, the next stop after Melitopol will definitely be the coast of the Sea of Azov to the south of Melitopol. The Russian forces increased their dominance over the Sea of Azov by completely occupying the coastline of the Azov Sea. But this situation will end with the advancement of Ukrainian forces along with British tanks. After the landing of Ukrainian forces on the coast of the Azov Sea, it will be possible to attack Crimea from both Kherson and Zaporizhia. At the same time, the access of Russian forces in the Russian mainland and in eastern Ukraine to Crimea will be restricted. From the moment the city of Melitopol returns to Ukrainian control, the liberation of Crimea will be a matter of a moment, and this situation will give a heavy blow to Russian leader Vladimir Putin's occupation campaign. In addition to this possibility, when combined with an event confirmed by geolocation images last day that the Ukrainian forces have the main combat tanks, Challenger 2, we can say that in the coming days we are likely to encounter a major tank war show. We witnessed a train full of Russian T-62 medium tanks headed to Ukraine. Russia has also dismantled its T-34 tanks. The T-62 tank entered service in 1961 and was one of the most produced and most used tanks in the world. However, these tanks were stored for a long time in warehouses across Russia. Russian troops do not have full knowledge of tanks that have not been in use for a long time. While it is unknown when these armored vehicles will reach the front row, it seems increasingly likely that they will face modern MBTs, including the British Challenger 2 and the German Leopard 2. The British-made Challenger 2 tank is considered to be the most robust armor in the world. The Challenger 2 models use the same diluted uranium, added Chobham armor as the Abrams tank. These powerful British tanks have a 120mm wireless tank Bolt 1200 Perkins CV12 engines weighing 62.5 tons, a range of 450 kilometers, and a maximum speed of 59 kilometers. Therefore, joining these war gods on the Ukrainian front lines will cause the Russians to face a very big problem. Even Western tanks at NATO level, including British Challenger, 2 main combat tanks, have the power to shorten the duration of this war, according to most military experts. In addition, the British Challenger 2 is a modern weapon that cannot be compared to the T-62. The first 18 state-of-the-art Leopard 2, considered to be the most talented MBT serving in the world, was delivered to the Ukrainian crew, which is currently being trained on the platform. Berlin initially promised 14 MBTs, but adding the number to 18. Portugal has contributed 3 tanks and Sweden 10 more tanks. This will allow Ukraine to use a full army of Leopard 2 tanks. On the other hand, Poland, the most enthusiastic country to send tanks to Ukraine, has supplied Ukraine with a battalion of former Leopard 2A4 models. Although Leopard 2 is not as advanced as the variant sent from German armor, these old Polish tanks are much more capable than the T-62s, which advanced towards the front rows of Russian trains. The Ukrainian army, equipped with modern Western weapons, has saved 8 villages in the last 2 weeks since the start of the counterattack, while crossing Russian positions and defense measures one by one, and has made a 400-kilometer advance. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin does not acknowledge that an attack on Ukraine has begun, the rising Russian losses show the opposite. In recent days, a Kremlin official who refused to disclose his name claimed that the Russian Ministry of Defense had not communicated Russian losses to President Putin, and that Putin still believed the superiority of war in the Russian army when compared with Russian military losses. President Putin's claims may reflect the truth in such a devastating situation of the Russian army. Modern Western weapons and well-trained Ukrainian soldiers, as well as the largest share of Ukrainian military planners. The attack on Ukraine with months of thoughtful strategies is one of the biggest reasons why the Ukrainian army could easily cross the Syrian defense lines. Here in this news, we will tell you about the strategies of the attack on Ukraine and how successful these strategies are. The tactics chosen by the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Valery Zaluzhny, are quite effective, as is clearly seen in the fields of action. Roman Svetin, a military expert in the Ukrainian Armed Forces, said Zaluzhny has positioned his troops well for the most difficult operations. Svetin noted that the success of General Zaluzhny's counterattack plan succeeded in denying Putin's pledges to deny the counterattack. In fact, for Putin, Zaluzhny left Ukraine and is hiding abroad. But in reality, he is at the head of the general army in Ukraine and managed. It is the counterattack in the best way. It is very clear that Russian President Vladimir Putin has problems with the perception of reality. It is no longer possible to distinguish between the conversations being held in Ukraine and those being held abroad. This is a clear example of Putin's continued contempt for the Ukrainian government and military. But while the battlefield is a grave for Russian soldiers, President Putin's misjudgments are also a sign of Ukraine's advancement. just as it is breaking down the morals of its soldiers. So which tactics of attack has Zelensky chosen? Ukrainian military officials said Zelensky has chosen the correct and effective counterattack tactics. Ukrainian forces are launching wing attacks to capture, destroy or capture the first Russian line of defense. Meanwhile, this first Russian line calls for support for Russian troops from the second front line. The Ukrainian armed forces are provoking the Russians to such a move to destroy them with the help of artillery in motion. At this point, it is not surprising that the Ukrainian troops have dismantled 1,000 Russians in a day. This means that 1,000 Russians were seriously wounded, and the ammunition they used would not return to the battlefield. So what measures did the Russians take against this strategy? According to Ukrainian military officials, the Russians are trying to pull the Ukrainian armed forces to places that are more difficult for them, making it easier for them to supply equipment. This is why the Ukrainian armed forces are working near Orikhiv, the shortest route of Ukrainian logistics, and the Russians are forced to carry their heavy vehicles from Rostov for several days. Russia is trying to pull the Ukrainian armed forces into Donetsk and Luhansk because the shortest route of supply from Russia is Donetsk and Luhansk. In particular, they want to draw the Ukrainian army to the Luhansk front, which is only a few dozen kilometers away from Veluki, to reach the weapons and seals coming from Russia faster. As for the direction of Bakhmut there, as expected, Prigozhin set up a trap for Russian troops. When the Ukrainian army saw that the blockade had begun, it pulled its troops and sent in experienced troops to their place. This became one of the main reasons for the Russian behavior in Bakhmut. Bakhmut is a 100% loss for the Russians in the north of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian armed forces take over Russian-controlled territories as in the south of Ukraine. Sooner or later the Russians will have to leave because they are surrounded. The troops here are likely to be shifted to Popasna and from there to places where the Russian defense lines are dense. But in the current state of Bakhmut, entrances and exits to the city are closed by the Ukrainian army. The successful strategies of Ukrainian military planners allowed the Ukrainian army to record advances on both the eastern and western fronts. But the main advancement of the Ukrainian army was the southern front with relatively weaker lines of defense than the eastern front. This floating Zaporozhye direction has become a serious front where Ukrainian troops use most of their power to try to break the Russian defense. The Ukrainian army, which has sent dozens of armored vehicles to the war, is experiencing difficult times for the Russian army in the city of Orikhiv and nearby settlements. According to Ukrainian officials, with the support of the Russian army's 70th camp, the fighters of the 291st camp, along with intelligence, special forces, pilots and artillery, are struggling to resist the attacks of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian forces managed to infiltrate the Russian army's front lines. Russian troops are trying to strengthen their remaining positions despite heavy losses. The Ukrainian army continues to bring new units into the operation to maintain and expand control over the region. The situation in the region of Robertino became so complicated that Russian troops had to leave positions and withdraw. The Ukrainian army has seized much of the Russian positions in the region and has made quite good progress. But Russia's defense forces are not stopping to counter the powerful attacks of the Ukrainian army. The Russian Air Force is actively acting to suppress Ukrainian forces and suppress the advance of the army. But the use of ground-to-air missiles by the Ukrainian strike forces is disrupting the efforts of the Russian Air Force. The pressure in the area is very high. The morals of the Russian troops who cannot stop the advance of the Ukrainian army are collapsing. The Ukrainian army is attacking various areas of the Russian defense line, exploring the weaknesses it can take advantage of in Donbass and southern Ukraine. Kiev has not yet made a statement, but all of the attack forces are now on the ground and actively advancing. What is happening in Donbass in the southern part of Donbass? Ukrainian forces are attacking Russian defense lines. The Ukrainian army made considerable progress with the support of infantry and mechanized troops as well as artillery forces. But dealing with Russian defense hypothesis is slowing Ukraine's progress somewhat. Russian forces have built the most extensive defense arbitration line in recent history. Since rumors of an attack on Ukraine came out months ago, most of these arbitrations list of 3 and 4 lines of defense. Typically, the first 2 defense lines will be passed by the attacker, but are designed to slow it down and direct the attacking units to better defended areas. But despite the ongoing attack on Ukraine, the Kremlin still believes it is the initiative itself. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have made considerable progress in Bakhmut. In a statement issued by the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, it was that border guards attached to the Ukrainian army advanced north of Bakhmut, dispersing most of the Russian troops there. The Ukrainian State Border Guard Service also shared a video from its social media accounts about how border guards fought against Russian troops. According to Ukrainian advocates, the main task now is to deactivate as many Russian infantry units as possible. For this purpose, the Ukrainian Defense Forces are using Western weapons, including unmanned aircraft, automatic bombers, hoverboards, and HIMARS. In addition, the air reconnaissance units of the Ukrainian State Border Guard are doing a very good job in locating Russian troops and giving these coordinates to artillery units. The Ukrainian Artillery Forces, which fired the coordinates given by the air reconnaissance unit from one, deported a total of 10 Russian soldiers during these operations. It was also that some Russian troops could not withstand intense artillery pressure and voluntarily surrendered to border guards. The border guards did not give a clear figure about the number of Russian soldiers who surrendered. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, 300 Russian troops have surrendered to the border guards since the start of the operation in Bakhmut, which was already under siege before the offensive against Ukraine. There is now a small area of about 30% controlled by the Russians. The Eastern Command of the Ukrainian Army said on Monday that Ukrainian forces were advancing up to a mile in the wings of Bakhmut. It was also stressed that the progress took place from the southern and northern wings and that most of the Russian exit routes were closed. The Eastern Command said on Monday that 186 Russian soldiers were killed as prisoners of war in the region. 224 were wounded and 8 were taken prisoner. However, Russia continues to supplement its airborne units in Bakhmut. The Eastern Command said this was a clear indication of Moscow's efforts to hold the city. The Ukrainian army knows the Russians targets their troops, their commanders, their tactics. However, it is quite clear that nothing will help the Russian troops in Bakhmut in the current situation. So what about the rest of the front? The Ukrainian army is also responding to efforts in the south outside of Bakhmut. Overall, the Ukrainian army, which has made progress in the Tavria, Kherson, and Mariupol regions, continues to receive its biggest gains in these regions. Tavria Military Sector Commander General Alexander Tarnavsky said the same day that Ukrainian forces attacked Russian positions more than 1,000 times last day. According to Tarnavsky, about 3 Russian soldiers were killed and wounded during the same period. A total of 16 Russian elements were destroyed, including a tank, a multi-missile rocket, a bus, and 5 ammunition warehouses. However, according to the chairman of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the Russian forces attempted an attack in the Bakhmut, Lyman, and Marinka sectors, where 20 conflicts occurred in the east. In a statement, the head of the Ukrainian headquarters said that Russian forces in the south have made great efforts to stop the advance of Ukraine. Russian forces also attacked 30 settlements in the regions of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk. The head of the headquarters also that a Russian sabotage group's attempt to enter the northern Sumy Oblast failed. The Kremlin may think that the superiority of the war is still in it. It is not surprising to conclude that the Kremlin administration and the Russian army no longer have the power to fight. Thank you for following us.